Hello everyone, and today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is Dr. Ian Baker, author of a number of books, including Tibetan Yoga, Principles and Practices, the most recent one. So I think we're going to kick off there. And Ian, I just want to say welcome and thanks for coming on.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to be invited. I mean, I know your work and through the various the perspectives that you offer on the practice of yoga in our kind of contemporary times, and so it's a pleasure to share some thoughts on how Tibetan yoga and in general, which is also Tantric yoga, will sheds light on, in some ways, the evolution of modern postural yoga and Astanga yoga in particular. So happy to be here.
Yeah, it seems like, as I understand it, I think Tantric yoga comes back into India from Tibet and Nepal. Is that correct? Do you want to kind of give some overview on the basis
in
of
part, what sort of intrigues me, with the Astanga yoga, as we know, with Krishnacharya, there was this in the kind of you could say revelation of the form of Astanga yoga is attributed at least to his what he learned allegedly at the foot of Mount Kailash at Lake Manasarovar from his teacher there. And even as he said, the first images, postures in Astanga yoga, coming from the daughter of his teacher. And this being a text that was, again, allegedly a Nepalese text, I think Yoga Karunta, that somehow has sort of vanished. So it's very interesting to look at, you could say, the modern postural yoga, let's say with Krishnamacharya sort of launching it, as it were, but with its origins in Tibet and the Himalayan world, with practices that are diverse, but at the same time have obviously very strong common elements with between the traditions. So that's something that, in the Tibetan yoga, so I'll be teaching and have been going to Norway every spring or early summer, as I will be this year, and in this case a course on looking at Hatha Yoga, Tantra, and the subtle body, which we can also think of as the yogic body. It's the the body, the energy body, if you will, the energy field in which our practice takes place. And as we know from Astanga yoga, as well as all Hatha Yoga traditions, there's a whole kind of esoteric physiology of the body that's based not upon the circulation of blood but on the circulation of prana, so vital energy, and looking at the different models in which that's been historically presented, through the flow of the nadi, the prana, and the bindu, through these flows of energy through the body, with a kind of vital force that is not the breath, but is somehow still connected with the breath. And as we expand the breath through the pranayama, we're kind of connecting with that vital force. So Tibetan yoga, if you will, which traces its origins to Indian yoga. So it's not that they're kind of separate traditions. It's just that each cultural context has kind of led to different emphases and different elaborations. So in my book, what I've focused on is the movement practices in Tibetan Buddhism, which have been relatively less known. And yet we know Hatha Yoga is something around the world, which is so readily available now. And the interesting thing to me when I first conceived of the book on Tibetan Yoga was the degree to which these physical practices, some of which are very similar to what we see in modern postural yoga, have been kept, rigorously hidden in the Tibetan tradition. And it appeared to me for no good reason. And so that's why I thought it was useful to write a book on the physical practices in Tibetan Buddhism, and how those actually just provide a foundation for so-called 6 tantric yogas, which are the physical yogas, as it is even with Astanga yoga, are a foundation for deeper levels or different access points, as it were, into a kind of more unified field of consciousness that yoga union is really about. So that's kind of what I'll be presenting in Norway and have worked with. So looking at how these physical practices, working with the transformation of metabolic heat into mystic fire, and the luminosity and the dream
The
yoga.
Tumo, I think people are very interested in this idea, and
Yeah,
kind of Wim Hof has taken that and run with it, kind of
he really has. It is
eating the
amazing.
body, and it's become
Yeah,
really popular. But I should have said at the start,
yeah.
your background was almost. I mean, I've seen a lot of your stuff and in different images, and you're literally like an explorer, aren't you? You've been around Tibet and trekked to all these monasteries, and
Hmm.
spent a lot of time kind of in the field,
Yes.
looking at so.
Yeah.
And that should be mentioned to our listenership straight away, that Ian
Mhm.
is not a dry scholar here. I mean, literally, you look at his website, there's all these images of him trekking in the mountains and to find these Tibetan temples, and research this stuff. So that's what really sparked my interest in your work, Ian. But
Mm.
I wonder, when you were doing this, did you ever find any text that at all made you consider that the mythical Yoga Karunta and the Krishnamacharya story might have some basis to it? Was there anything that kind of, there might be guys out there that are doing this kind of thing? Because I've seen other guys or seen other texts that suggest that there might be a precedent somewhere.
No, absolutely, and it's exactly as you said. I mean, the book Tibetan Yoga Principles and Practices is presenting these esoteric tantric Buddhist yogas from a scholarly perspective, but also in terms of the practice and how they also correlate across traditions. But as you said, my real passion and background was really exploring. I lived in the Himalayan world for decades, and another book I wrote called The Heart of the World: A Journey to the Last Secret Place, which was a really decades of research into looking at the origins of these traditions, but in how as they were located within a Tibetan Buddhist tradition called Beyu, or hidden lands. And this is a place where, according to tradition, some of the most vital esoteric yoga traditions originated. And so my interest was going back to the source and looking at how can we connect with the original impetus of the yogic practices. So that did, as you said, sort of involve years of going off to faraway places throughout Tibet and the Himalayas. And so the book is, an illustrated book that includes a lot of my photographs during that.
Yeah, it looks wonderful.
period.
I'd love to see a slideshow. Like, do you do those when you go
Yeah,
to
I
do these
will, and that's
presentations?
essentially
Yeah.
what I'll be doing in Norway this time, what I have been doing in the past. So Tumo, for example, the inner heat, and when you're talking about a kind of a source text, I mean, we've seen now even now at the University of London at SOAS, at the School for Oriental and African Studies, they have a whole, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware, there's a whole now a legitimacy of academic study of Hatha Yoga. And so Jim Mallinson, who is a friend and one of the kind of founders of that school of study, literally at SOAS, has identified a text called the Amrita Siddhi, the perfection of nectar, or the different ways to translate it. But Siddhi, meaning yogic accomplishment, and Amrita, it's how do we actually generate through our practice a kind of life-bestowing elixir of longevity or immortality within our system. And that's really, what he and Mark Singleton, who both together wrote the book on the roots of yoga, recognize, or they refer to as the root text of the Hatha Yoga tradition, in part because it's the first text that identifies sort of three yogic postures that we can recognize from later postural yoga as ways of activating this kind of central channel, the Shushumna, the Avaduti, as the kind of site of transformation. So if we think of a yogic body, where does all of this take place? It's happening within our core of our being, which is literally, in the yoga tradition, seen as the central channel that flows through us, and how we can unify our mind and our body and our breath in that core. And so the Amrita Siddhi text is the first really quite comprehensive description of activating that energy system. And so I find that fascinating when I look, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, some of the earliest accounts, for anyone in your audience who's aware of Tibetan Buddha or Tantric Buddhism being brought to Tibet in the 8th century, a figure named Padmasambhava, the lotus born. And when we look at some of these early texts that even describe who his teachers were, we look at what was he introduced to that was actually at the very foundation of his own realization. And it's a practice that is based on, as you said, what we see in its kind of contemporary practice as something Wim Hof has kind of repackaged. But it's a core method by which we use the breath, focus the mind and focus the breath, and work with subtle as well as very dynamic movements of the body in order to bring about a completely kind of reversal of our normal experience of the body-mind. And that is the inner fire that is, as these early texts describe, it sort of burns away our kind of limited, the conceptual mind, the thinking mind, so as to introduce a kind of more blissful, ecstatic consciousness. So the purpose of inner heat yoga was not, it was adapted in Tibet to stay warm and remote part, but the whole point was, didn't need that so much in India, where the practice began. There it was called Chandali, and it was a practice for using that inner heat as a basis for, literally as the early texts like the Vajra Tantra describe, for burning away the obscurations to that enlightened awareness or state of mind that is our actual natural state. And so I always found that, really interesting how it has evolved over time and in different cultural contexts. Really
Was that the fundamental practice then? This generation
practice.
of inner heat,
see
right?
that in
I mean, I think, just for our audience, I mean, maybe laying out the practical groundwork of what the Tibetan yogas entail. I mean, I have a little basis of understanding in Tibetan yoga, but I think most people won't know what the kind of practices are at all, and that would be useful so they can compare them to the modern Hatha Yoga practices, right? I mean, I suppose you saw. I mean, were monks still practicing them when you went to the monasteries?
Yes, no, absolutely. And this is, again, something I found fascinating is that, because I was there in Nepal, from the 1970s sort of onward, as it were, and all through the 80s. And at those times, these kind of practices were really hidden, very, very hard to get any information about. And they were considered secret practices. And there were, various reasons given for that. But it's interesting how, in the last decade, or even a lot in the last 5 years, a lot of these practices that were previously hidden are now kind of widely available as online teachings, as courses. And I think it's a good thing because, if yoga is about practices that can open us to expand our sense of who and what we are in the world and free us from the kind of limitations that, keep us in a more constricted sense of identity, as it were, then that's all to the good. And I think that's even being recognized now in the Tibetan Buddhist world, where practices such as Tummo or inner fire are being taught now more openly. And as they always were at the origins of the tradition, which is what I found fascinating, they didn't have any kind of prerequisites. That was the deep dive that you made right from the outset. And I think it's kind of returning to that, because I think in the contemporary world, people don't need or have patience for a lot of the cultural elaborations, the monasticization, if you will, of Tantrism. That there's a lot of it is in a monastic context. A lot of it is ritual and visualization and ceremony, which worked it served its purpose in the Middle Ages, if you will, in India and Tibet. But, I think what we're all interested in now is the takeaway from all of that. And what are the most vital practices that can bring about a changed and altered experience of our lives and the lives of others and our connectedness.
Get to the bottom line. Get
to the bottom line.
What can I actually do to help myself here?
Exactly. So I think that's what I've been focusing on the last two programs that we've done in Norway have looked at the evolution, if you will, of the practice of Tummo or inner fire, and that was together with a very highly revered scholar, practitioner, monk actually from Nepal named Dopo Tuku, who has been teaching Tummo in a quite traditional context, with initiations, with really deep foundations that he provides in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, and then introduction to the core practice. But again, by tradition, it's done in a very systematic, very careful way. And the idea behind that is that unless there's a really firm grounding in the psychology and philosophy of the Buddhist path, and particularly the bodhisattva ideal of that all one's practice is done not for oneself alone, but for all benefit of all beings. The view there is that if you start entering these ecstatic states of blissful awareness, and that unless that's undertaken for the benefit of all beings, that it can kind of lead to ego inflation rather than kind of expansion of being into the world as a whole.
So would you say the basis then of these practices is the tumo, is the heating? Because I mean, it just makes me reflect on the idea, the Patanjali line, tapas, being the tapas, svadhyaya, ishvara, pranidhana, kriya, the effort of yoga, the mechanistic idea is based on tapas, to heat. Yeah. Would you say that then that is the kind of the foundation of all yoga practice, to create an inner heat in the body, to literally burn the vasanas, the samskaras, the karma up. Right.
No, very, very much. And it's very much articulated that way in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. They talk about tumo as the inner heat as the foundation of the path of all of the esoteric inner tantric yogas. Without a foundation in tumo, which is, as you say, tapas, the asceticism, if we will, that sort of burns away the afflictive emotions, or as we, looking at the Yoga Sutras, those sort of the vacillations, the fluctuations of mind that arise, in our thoughts and emotions. If we're not centered in that state of kind of ecstatic being, we're not ecstatic in the sense we're all out of ourselves, but just an inner state of deep, profound well-being. And when that state is intact, then naturally expands into the other practices that we might be engaging in. So I think tapas is something that we can see as the common denominator across traditions. And it's very much that same way, even when we look at the origins of Qigong, for example, in Chinese context. We have texts going back to the 2nd century BC, before there was even the term Qigong, it was Yangshen, which meant self-cultivation. And that self-cultivation was working with qi in the body in order to bring about that transformation of being through kind of what we would see as the counterpart of the chakra system as it developed later in the Indian and Tibetan traditions, as dantian, as these kind of alchemical elixir fields in the body, that we can all recognize, in the gut, in the heart, and the head. So in a way, you said these 3 fields of transformation, and it was referred to in kind of alchemical terms, but it also involved this idea of vital heat as a way of burning away, as you say, the samskaras and the obscuring emotions that are freed when we can feel identified with something. Yeah. So more compelling than our afflictive thoughts and emotions.
Well, also more kind of somehow more alluring than just the idea that it's just asceticism, that tapas is just like an ascetic striving. It's a literal physical heating. And if you look at, like, I don't know whether you're aware of this idea, but apparently there's these little holes in Cornwall in the UK, right? And then they're in the south of England, and then people have the idea that the ancient civilizations would go down to these holes and basically like a sweat lodge, and heat themselves up, and it was ritualistic heating practices. And I kind of feel that this heating of the body has been at the basis of all spiritual traditions, right? Although albeit mainly lost now. I think there's and we see remnants of it in the sauna, sweat lodge culture of North America, Native American Indians, or even the sauna, the idea of kind of the sauna and heating of Scandinavian. I shouldn't call them Scandinavians, but
no, of course,
European people.
No, I love the idea. I mean, it's so profound. I mean, you see the Native American tradition too, with the sweat lodges
again,
and they are, those were as they have been in the Nordic countries too. The idea of sauna, they were not just places for relaxing at the end of the day. They were places in which great political alliances and allegiances took place within this kind of transformative heat. So it was actually working on a collective as well as an individual basis. But I had not heard about these these thermal holes in
That
Cornwall. I love the
Yeah,
idea.
you'll be interested in that. I mean, that's one idea that they've got of these. That they can't figure out what these holes were for, but they're all around in certain parts of Cornwall, and they assume that it's an old kind of pagan
Mm-hmm.
use of this heating principle, and even I mean, it's like thought. When you get hot, thought becomes clearer. You had
Mm-hmm.
heard the idea that Descartes was trapped in a heated room when he wrote the Meditations, and he couldn't get. I mean, I don't know whether it's kind of like a folklore etymology, but he was trapped in this room with a hot stove, and,
Okay.
uh, and he had this, kind of this premonition whereby the meditations, I think therefore I am was born, but maybe you needed a bit more heat to to develop
Just
his
develop it
dualism,
longer. Yeah.
develop his
Well,
dualism.
yeah, maybe the heat deprivation would limit
Yeah.
that. But no, I love the idea, and I think it's this idea of really at it being at the foundation in many respects of. I mean, we know also from the Celtic tradition they had the practice called, which I think there's not great detail known about it, but it's referred to in some early texts, as I understand, called the three cauldrons practice. And there's a cauldron at the navel, again at the heart and the head, and they were literally kind of alchemical transformations that occurred of the will, heart. I mean, it's a tradition I'm interested in, but haven't really found someone who knows a lot about. But it
Mm.
does seem very interesting in some ways, that we can relate to from our kind of Anglo-Saxon background about these three alchemical cauldrons in the body and how that transformation of the will, meaning our own volitional energy, it's a kind of tapas, literally, and how that transforms the heart. And then through the transformation of the heart, it's also the purification, the burning away of the obscuring thoughts and emotions that might limit the way in which we even intellectually engage with reality through our heads. So
Mm.
to me, I love that idea that it's a kind of, and particularly what you've told me about, these thermal pits, as it were, in Cornwall. The fact that maybe this practice is, I'd like to imagine at least that some of
I think it's
the three
yeah,
cauldron practice was
pan
conducted.
universal, perhaps.
Yeah, very
Um,
universal. I
So
mean,
you'll be
and
teaching. I mean, I assume that you've learnt these yogas, and you'll be
yeah.
teaching them in Norway every year. You teach them in Norway, right? And maybe other
Mhm.
seminars as well.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. How could you say anything practical about how you what they entail, how you teach them, the use
Yeah.
of breath and bandha? I'm sure people are going to be thinking, oh, is it similar? Are they doing the asanas? Are they, what does bandha mean? How is the breathing meant to be?
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
jumping? Is there jump backs involved?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's yeah. When we look at all of these practices and their common ground. So even that, since you invoked Wim Hof at the beginning, which I think is so interesting that he's taken sort of very core pranayama practices like Bastrika and just kind of put them together and with a Beiderkumbak, with a held out breath. And we can see, and because he's, has these sort of some degree supernormal capacities in here in terms of which he may be naturally endowed with, but obviously part of his mission has been to show how just doing this very, very simple practice can result in a kind of enhanced immunity, certainly in expansion of our respiratory capacity. So I think he's actually been very important in helping people to do a 10-minute practice that can really have an enduring benefit in people's lives. But what we're looking at basically is a foundational breathing practice of the either Kapalbhati or Vastrika, but this idea of a complete expansion of our respiratory capacity, and then holding the breath out to, as he describes it, till we get the gasp reaction where we can no
Mm.
longer hold the breath out any longer, and then the whole catalyzing effect on the autonomic nervous system that occurs when we put ourselves into, I think, what those who have done research on him have interpreted as a kind of fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's when the body kind of goes into all of its resources are centered. But when you have a fight or flight reaction in the context of a deeply safe space, such as contemplative practice, then something else arises. And I think that's where this kind of what he identified as kind of a core practice to inner fire, as his website used to be called, I think is very interesting, because then at the end of that, then Then there's the held, the vase breath that we see in the Tibetan tradition, the kumbhaka breath. And so we see this really at the fundamental core of the Tibetan Tummo practice. I mean, there are different lineages of it, different transmissions of it, some complicated, some simple. But at the heart, it is not really that different from what Wim Hof has presented. One difference, however, is that in the Tibetan tradition, they don't favor rapid breathing. They believe
I was
that
going to say, I mean, it seems like he's kind of hyperventilating.
He's hyperventilating. And, there's a lot of evidence that that's beneficial. I mean, we look at James Nestor's work, with his book Breath, and we can actually see that hyperventilation for short periods of time can be very energizing for the body. And then if it goes into very naturally extended breath holdings and out breathing, in a certain sense, you prepared the ground for that through a short practice of rapid breathing. But the Tibetans don't generally, it's not part of the tradition, at least, to do it that way. Whereas in Tibetan, it's also the Nadi Shodhana, the clearing, the ninefold breathing, clearing the side channels right from the outset, as opposed to at least what I've been taught from Indian teachers, is that it's sometimes better to do the Kapalbhati or the Vastrika, the rapid breathing first. And then when you've energized the system, then you want to kind of quiet the nervous system through, whatever technique you use for balancing the side channels. And I find that, quite a natural way to do it. And then, let's say in the Tibetan tradition of Tummo, once you've sort of then brought about this kind of unified energy and focusing it in the, below the navel, in an area that, the Zen tradition would call the Hara, Qigong tradition would call the Dantian, the lower elixir field. I mean, we're the lower cauldron even in the Celtic analogs of these traditions. Or the Khanda, in some of the more esoteric, not esoteric.
I think, does it not correlate to the Uddiyana Bandha?
Absolutely, yeah. Uddiyana Bandha would be, when you're pulling in the lower
it's not an energy field, but the same area? The
same area, yeah, exactly the same area as Uddiyana Bandha. And Khanda is an interesting term that's used kind of as the site of Kundalini. It's kind of like an egg below the navel, spherical egg, and sort of where Kundalini arises from. And you'll see some even iconography where, the Kundalini, the serpent, kind of wrapped around a kind of lingam-like egg below the navel. So that whole area of what we call, and even in the early Yangchen practices of early China, they refer to this kind of wonderful term. They call it the dark cavity, which is an interesting term. So so
the Kundalini and the Kund is not just simply Indian. You're seeing it in Tibetan and Chinese.
Yeah, and even in these early second century BC, where we have texts from Brahmas and caves in what's now Sichuan province in India. In China, they refer to channels, what they call mai, at that point. And then a lot of these are where the practice of cultivating awareness of the channels and using them as kind of media for transformation comes from the dark cavity, which is this pelvic cavity. We could really refer to it in kind of anatomical terms. And that's, as you say, where the Kundalini arises from. It's where the Tummo arises from. And it all has to do with this idea of some kind of transformative heat, where we're transforming metabolic fire into some kind of noetic fire.
David Gordon White's work on the idea that there's a kind of trail from India and to China. I wonder what you think about this. Does it come out from India to China and then kind of get developed and around China, Tibet, and Nepal, and then come back in, or how do you see the kind of the geographical kind of progression or chronology in this?
Yeah. Now, are you referring to his the alchemical body, or the kiss of the yogini, or
I can't remember which book it was.
He has some wonderful titles for his works.
They're all good. I recommend anyone to read them all.
Kind of scholarly academic perspective, there's a lot of debate still. There's recognition of the common ground between traditions in early China, traditions in early India. It's interesting, textual sources in China are earlier than any textual sources we have in India. So that has led some people to speculate that while these texts somehow came along on the Silk Roads and into India and maybe influenced. We see in the Indian Tantric tradition, for example, they often refer to what's called Chinachara, the Chinese way, interestingly. And so there's certainly evidence that there was knowledge that was introduced into the Tantric systems, whether Hindu or Buddhist in India, from China. A variety of techniques, particularly ones that dealt with sexual practices. And those are all, very much at the heart, really, of the Tantric Buddhist traditions. If we look at the early Buddhist Tantras, they clearly weren't designed for celibate monks. So that has led to, a lot of questions about who were the audience for these practices and how did they get transformed into a celibate monastic system in Tibet, for example. But anyway, so I think the point there is I think there's no way to really firmly establish, where they began, but there was clearly so much exchange of knowledge along these trade routes, whether we call them the Silk Roads or the Musk Trails, so much knowledge and was shared along these routes that, one can only imagine how heady some of these ancient caravan routes were when people were trading not just spices and tonics, but also knowledge. And I think to me, just to sort of jump ahead what I find fascinating about that is to see the common element, which as you're identifying as this sort of vital, cultivating a kind of transformative or vital heat that actually transforms our sense of being. And to see the variety of ways in which across these traditions that's been practiced, and to therefore recognize that there's not just one way. It can be the Wim Hof method. It can be these ancient Yangshen traditions of Kan and Li, these transformations of water and fire, we see in the ancient Chinese tradition. Or it can be the Chandali practice, which was, we have in the early Tantric Buddhist texts. Chandali was connected with the funeral pyres, the heat from the funeral pyre. And then that was translated literally into Tumo in Tibetan, which means literally the fierce feminine energy. And then, we translate that sometimes as kind of inner fire. But the whole idea was that it was a transformative heat that was often in the Tibetan tradition and the Indian identified with the feminine. And that's interesting because where we see the first evidence for these kind of practices in Tantric Buddhism, at least, is in what are called the Yogini Tantras. So these were tantras that clearly take they're kind of associated with tantric goddesses, and they're identified with through the practice, and these are simultaneous with the emergence of the Shakta Tantras in India, where the whole earlier Shaiva tradition sort of went through its own transformation through the power of Shakti, which is the animating force. So I think all of these things are found. So we have not just this core element of the inner fire, but we also have its association with powerful goddesses, whether in Hindu Tantra or in the Buddhist Tantras. And one might argue too, even when we look at the Celtic tradition, which I think is interesting because it's kind of in our own DNA, the free cauldron practices.
I like that one. Yeah,
who were these priestesses of Avalon? We think of them all as myths and fairy tales because they're so close to us, but then we tend to romanticize the myths and fairy tales of the East just simply because they're more exotic. But
the Knights of the Round Table, and then there's loads of stuff in Cornwall about the idea that Jesus came over. He actually came because they were mining tin or something. That's the connection. It's like a tin trading. So they come over. Apparently, he comes over to Cornwall, and there's a lot of spirituality, kind of particularly around that area of England. But I wonder. Have you ever seen? I mean, it's a question I've kind of wanting to ask, but it seems a bit lowbrow now. But I remember in the Tibetan monasteries, they often actually do these practices where they go out in the snow at night time and they put the towels over them, the cold towels, and they're in the snow and they're burning. That there's the heat generated like that they're actually warming the towels and drying the towels. Have you actually seen that demonstration of that heat?
Yeah, I have, and there's a lot of it's still very much a tradition that was traditionally used to kind of test the results of if it went into a kind of meditative retreat, generating this vital heat then at the end of that period of the retreat, that was the way you could demonstrate, your accomplishment, and it was often done very publicly. So, and it still is. And so often at the coldest time of year in eastern Tibet, people will come out, and then they've had these sheets sort of soaked in ice water, and then you have to sort of put them around you as you walk barefoot, sometimes quite length of time, and trying to, you're drying them out just through the very fact that you've cultivated this vital heat in your system. And it's very evident that, so, some people in your audience may be aware of what was traditionally called the 3-year, 3-month, 3-day retreat.
The Lama retreat, yeah.
Yeah, the Lama in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that sort of then you come out of that and you're Lama. So a lot of that now is has a very rigorous curriculum, but part of it is intellectual, part of it is practice, a whole range of practices. But from one of my teachers, said, well, what that originally was, it wasn't going through all these elaborate practices. The whole core of it was 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days is what you needed to work with, to transform that metabolic heat into a kind of mystic heat. And that was the whole point. And originally you would do that for 3 years. That was the sole practice. It's all based upon energy transformation rather than a kind of more conceptual training, which is to a large degree what a lot of it is now, where you do your refuge prayers and you do your merit, you gain merit. And, all he said, if you, as that teacher said, if you're able to transform your energy, all the rest is just cultural elaboration. So I love this idea. And what's really interesting, what may be interesting for some of your audience. So the training for the inner fire practice was different from what we see, in the Indian tradition normally of, even in some of the Tibetan lineages of the held breath, the kumbhaka, the vase breath, that's what we call it in Tibetan. So here, my one teacher, Dr. Nida Chanangsang, the training that they went through in a 3-year retreat, when you hold that breath as you would in a conventional kumbhaka hold, as it would be taught in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, then you churn the abdomen. So you're actually, and the traditional metaphor for that is churning milk into butter. So you're basically making your core of your body into a churn. And this idea that you're taking something like milk and comes down into kind of ghee, butter, which of course is something so highly revered in Indian tradition as well as in Tibetan. And then actually out of that, you get this kind of elixir, sometimes referred to metaphorically as the snow lion's milk, the milk of a snow lion, which is a mythical. But there it becomes
that churning is in a lot of texts as well, isn't it? This churning the oceans, or stir. Yeah. So that metaphor, maybe it always has this symbolic kind of inner meaning, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you said, we see it as this foundational myth too in the Hindu yoga traditions, turning the ocean to generate the elixir of immortality, soma. And then we think of that, it's as a myth, it's an external one where you have the devas, the kind of demigods who are churning, the asuras churning, the oceans to create the elixir. But a lot of that is in the esoteric tradition. It's just a metaphor for an internal process of churning that we can do, again, taking in one way our ordinary physiology, meaning metabolic heat, into something which in a way is subconscious, unconscious part of the autonomic nervous system, and making that a consciously experienced state of essentially blissful awareness, the Satchitananda, the bliss, clarity, and no thought, as it would be called in the Tibetan tradition. But it's also the Satchitananda, is sort of the truth. It's the fundamental consciousness, Buddha nature. However, each culture has kind of tried to give a name to this kind of unified field of awareness, which is transpersonal in the sense that we're unified in that ultimate goal of yoga, to become one with everything. And we're part of that. And through that, we're not lost. We're actually discover our true endowment.
So have you managed to do this yourself, to to achieve the Tumo effect.
Yeah, I think, to one degree or another. I can't say it's not something that I've ever,
Yeah.
I haven't done dedicated long
3
retreat.
years
Yeah,
in a cave.
nothing like that.
Yeah.
But I have, for shorter periods of retreat, where you think, well, which is really about catching fire. And I think that's something I definitely have experienced where, where you do the practice in a retreat context where suddenly your whole locus of focus changes. And all of a sudden, for me, the way I experienced it on the first time was doing this practice where you're concentrating this energy so much below the navel. And then suddenly, you sort of feel like you're not, we're so sort of head oriented usually. We see all of our sense fields are located on our heads, but what you're doing with a practice like this is using gravity, dropping it down to suddenly into the enteric nervous system. And suddenly you feel that you're seeing, hearing, sensing from this kind of lower. And there's interesting in certain iconography where you'll see a face, in, as it were, in the abdomen, because suddenly I think what's being referred to there is this kind of shift in consciousness, which becomes more primary, which is, what we talk about, gut reactions, intuition, all of these things. And those things become more and more evident. So it's not just so much about feeling the heat, which of course is part of it, but it's also what's happening to our awareness, what's happening to our consciousness as we shift from the head to, to the brain and the gut, as it were. And I think
do you think a lot of this is to do with maybe kind of balancing the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system? I mean, earlier I was thinking that when you're coming with those very heavy breaths and then calming it down with the Nadi Shodhana, seems to be some relation, as you mentioned, the fight or flight response with the rest and digest. I mean, it's a kind of a basic polarity, which I think the nervous system perhaps is more involved than that, but there does seem to be something in the yoga about these, this balance between the two. And I think people often take it to be yoga, that is, to be a practice to simply calm the nervous system. But if we look at it, it suggests the opposite. It looks like you're actually almost trying to stimulate that fight or flight response in a lot of these practices to kind of raise the kind of tone, let's say the tone of your state. Yeah.
Yep. No, and that's actually been investigated by neuroscientists. Maria Koznevnikov, who's a Russian neuroscientist who's done work with Tumo practitioners in eastern Tibet. And what she's recognized is that the initial phase of the practice, where you're working with visualization, you're working with intensive breath control, all of that, what you're doing is, rather than stimulating what we normally associate with meditation, the parasympathetic nervous system, rather than that, you're actually you're intensifying the sympathetic nervous system. And that's what the Tumo practice that she researched is sort of based upon. But then through that cultivation, then when you go into a state of relaxation, it's much more profound than if you try to go into the parasympathetic state of relaxation directly. And I think we all recognize that if we do something very intensely physical, we go for a long hike, even whatever it might be. Then, when we lie down to rest or something, you
must have experienced that many times in your.
It's spontaneous. You don't have to actually.
The best rest after a hike in the Himalayas.
So natural. So I think, so there's been studies on that, and if people are interested, they can just go online. And Maria Koznevnikov's research on female Tumo practitioners in Tibet is actually quite revealing, and follows up on work that began back in the 1980s by Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard University, where he was the first one to bring Tumo practitioners from Tibet, from Dharamsala in India, to be sort of studied, as it were, in the lab. And they did recognize that they could increase the heat production in the body, but sort of ignoring the fact that wasn't really the point.
Yeah.
the heat. But it was, it was a measurable outcome. And of
I
course,
think that's what people want, isn't it? They ultimately, want to does it work, and can I see quantifiable kind of material proof that
yeah,
something extra special can happen,
yeah, well, that's what
Yeah,
we
which is
I
the
think,
allure of, I think, a lot of the Tibetan stuff, is that there are these kind of magical ideas in Tibetan Buddhism, in Tibetan culture, right? And yeah,
yeah,
people,
yeah, that we do want the verifiable. It's like, well,
yeah,
if
yeah,
I'm going to invest in this, you want to see that they're actually results. So there is more and more work, going on about that in terms of this core practice, if you will, of the tantric yogic tradition. So tantra, in that sense, I'm sure with a lot of your audience are very aware, was really an expansion of at least in the Buddhist context, of the sutra tradition, which were the teachings that were given. And sutras, have etymologically the same root as the suture. We string together, because texts at that time were literally threaded together. And tantra has actually more the expression of weaving. It's the warp and the woof experience. So it sort of took the threads of the sutras and expanded them into the kind of tapestry of the tantras, and giving us a more richer and more textured idea of how reality and how our practice can advance, not in the kind of renunciatory way in which we can associate with early Buddhism in particular, through asceticism and some kind of a denial of the flesh, but through a full realization of its potential. And I think that was the beauty of the tantras, is it was a celebration of sensory awareness, and how it can be, by enhancing it, we can kind of go beyond the kind of conventional limits of ways in which we tend to delimit what our senses can reveal. We kind of go in again beyond the self into a kind of more unified, which is why all the energies were celebrated and used in Tantra, not just sexual energy, but everything. But it, in that sense, was a more expansive approach, you could say, to the spiritual path, than one of kind of, it didn't allow for that kind of separation between spirit and flesh, that we see, also sort of course, so much in the Western Christian, even Gnostic traditions. There's the flesh is evil, the spirit is good, and Tantra was, in a way, a very body positive approach, that where we could use all of these endowments for going beyond the conventional way in which we would relate to the world and to those energies within us.
and it seems in contrast to the earlier classical yoga as well. If we look at Bhagavad Gita or the sutras, they don't seem to be particularly bodily positive. Let's say they kind of treating the body as an obstacle to, or confusion to clear consciousness, rather than something which is, could offer a valid experience of knowledge in and of itself.
Exactly, and I think that's why it is so interesting to watch what's happening in the transformation of the yoga world today, as we begin to sort of own these practices and to kind of really want to focusing on what their essence is, how can they be applied within our own contemporary cultural context, rather than adhering to what might have been the context at the time that the Bhagavad Gita, was composed, where, I think it's just not an exciting idea to think of the body as some, even if we look at early Buddhism, for example, we think of in mindfulness, the original sila, or the original mindfulness practices in early Buddhism, was about meditating on your body, and the body of others is sort of quite disgusting. It's just for us. And it was a way of trying to cultivate detachment, but it was doing it through a kind of rejection of the sensory field of awareness, and labeling it in a very negative way, which is not the way, contemporary mindfulness practice is conducted. But in a certain sense, it has that baggage to it, which I think can sometimes limit even what mindfulness offers as a kind of secularized meditation practice. If we're still just attending to the rise and flow of the breath, and when thoughts arise, we're not judging them, we're just allowing them to pass through, which is actually quite different from what Buddhism had first proposed. Mindfulness was something you did with the mind, you did with the imagination, and then you could enter into, kind of deeper states of concentration when you left that behind. But I think it's then you went beyond, what the Tibetan tradition calls beyond mindfulness. You're going beyond what the mind, to a state, in a sense, of what lies beyond the mind as we conventionally understand it, as a repository of thoughts and emotions, or a producer of thoughts and emotions.
And finally, I just want to go back to something you said earlier about female practitioners, yoginis of this tradition. Is that in evidence in the text? Do you see? I mean, but probably of interest to our listenership, which is, I imagine, mainly women, more women than men. I mean, there's little record. It appears in the old text of female practitioners, but I think more is coming to light. Is that correct? There is a tradition of female yogis.
Very much so. Like, let's say, even at the origins of Tibetan Buddhism, sort of the mythic land from which these Buddhist tantras were said to have emerged is a place called Udayana, which is generally identified as being in the northwest frontiers of India in the Hindu Kush Mountains. It's where Padmasambhava, the great sage who Padmasambhava is said to have come from, and bringing Tantric Buddhism to Tibet at that time. But there are texts which have emerged now that are attributed to 7 particular great female Mahasiddhas, great realized yogic adepts of Udayana, who were female, including Lakshminkara, who would have been essentially the stepsister of Padmasambhava, in the sense that she was she was actually the sister of King Indrabhuti, who was the kind of adoptive father of Padmasambhava. So actually it would have been his stepsister. But she was a great tantric master. There are texts which we can see attributed to her, radical texts on the basis of the tantric deity Vajrayogini, a headless form. The headless form, where the blood spurting from the top of the neck, and what that represents in the esoteric tradition, of course, is the opening of the yogic body, of the side channels and the central channel in their full efflorescence, but coded in this kind of dramatic iconography of the headless yogini. Because why headless? Because in a certain sense, no longer identifying with, you could say, cerebral consciousness, but more with this incredible somatic release that comes. And so her works, and then she also references a whole lineage of female practitioners prior to her, Siddha Rajni, all of which are quite radical expressions of freedom from, you could say, one could argue, really the patriarchal control of these traditions. So, for example, Siddha Rajni was another one of these great female yogic adepts from Udayana, where she talks about, don't look for the external mandala, that's created. The real mandala is there in your body. It's composed of our own internal energies. Take refuge there. Don't look for a Buddha outside yourself, some kind of external form of authority and reference. Find it in your own intrinsic awareness. So I think these are really important, because what it starts to show us is that, the wisdom that was right there, at the heart of these traditions, at the same time that Tantric Buddhism was being established in a monastic form in Tibet. But if we look at where did it all come from? It came from these Mahasiddhas, male and female yogic adepts, to a certain degree, who'd rejected a lot of these monastic, ritualized, Brahmanically influenced forms of practice, and looking at something really based in the body. And what we see there is exactly what even we see in the Amrita Siddhi, which also refers to, this whole kind of vital heat in the body. They refer to it in the Amrita Siddhi, if I'm not mistaken, as kind of an inner sun, as it were, that, it's about shifting, finding that inner fire and using that radiance to emerge from and break free from kind of restrictive social and emotional psychological conditioning. So, yeah, in that sense, I think this inner fire, we look at, the female practitioner, or, really the teachers, that spoke to that in all of its elaborate forms through deity yoga, but we're identifying with deities that are just anthropomorphic fire in a certain sense. So the Vajrayogini, Vajravarahi deity in Tantric Buddhism, which a practitioner identifies with that, again, interestingly, with a female tantric deity while practicing the inner fire. The idea there is to kind of, we're not undertaking this practice with our conventional egoic identity. We're transforming ourselves, as it were, into a divine form, an anthropomorphic expression of wisdom, compassion, and radiance and heat. And so, it's a way of just trying to using, our conventional ways of. But again, I think in a contemporary context, we shouldn't forget that, those practices began at a time when people had a very dualistic relationship in general with gods and deities, and took them as being self-existing and external. So there was a very powerful idea in internalizing them, which is what the Tantrists did, and owning them. So it was a skillful means that was maybe appropriate for a time when people were over-identified with external forces of divine authority. And then suddenly here you were through the initiation process into the Tantras, like, oh no, the deity is you. So it was both frightening and empowering, and therefore, very energizing for one's practice. But, since we don't, in a contemporary context, so much struggle with external sources of divine authority.
I think one thing is the visualization practices have really been lost to modern yoga, and they obviously they're maintained within Tibetan Buddhism, which rests upon these practices to a great degree. And I think it's a shame because using the mind and visualizing things in the mind is a really powerful tool. And I think it's something which has always been the yoga tradition. I kind of imagine, but it's somehow been somewhat lost and not carried over, which
I think that's true. And then sometimes we know that, in visualization, sometimes it can get in the way of actually feeling the flow of energies and senses, and we overlay it with our imaginations. So it's a subtle balance sometimes, how we let the imagination serve a deepening of our experience, but not to let it at the same time overly control. I think once it sort of sparks that connection with our yogic body, as it were, then the feeling, the energy can take over.
So, Ian, I'm going to wrap up the interview now. I wonder if I know that we're doing something in Norway this weekend, and hopefully we'll try and get the podcast out. It's in May, and he does it every May in Norway with I think it's with On Yoga and Ellen Johansson, who's been on the podcast. You also mentioned people like Jim Mallinson has been on the podcast as well, and many other people that will accompany you on this kind of subject. So listeners, I encourage you to listen back to some of these interviews that kind of reference some of the things that Ian's been talking about. But I wonder where else we could continue listening to you, Ian, and learning more about this.
Yeah, so learning about these traditions, I'm now working very closely with a Tibetan Lama, who's also a traditional healer, named Dr. Nida Chanangsang. And we started a platform called the Vajra Path, which is basically looking at Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism kind of in its interface with the contemporary world. So that's something that anybody who's interested to follow this work, we're just developing. We just have a website out now called thevajrapath.com. We offer twice a year Vajra journeys, as they were. So this year is focusing on Bhutan and Tibet, which are journeys to places where there's the living tradition of Tantric Buddhism. So we have a trip, for example, in July to Tibet and Mount Kailash. And then we have a trip in October and November to Bhutan. These are places where, the Tantric Buddhist tradition is still thriving. And then next year, we're going to be looking at Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism as it evolved and transformed along the Silk Road, basically from Istanbul to Karakorum, so from Turkey to Mongolia. So these are things where people are interested in kind of living seminars, as they were, where we practice and at the same time look at the historical evolution of the Tantric Buddhist tradition. We did one last year, for example, in Greece, where we looked at the common ground between initiatic healing traditions in ancient Greece and what we can see as at the core of the Tantric Buddhist traditions as well. So the Vajrapath.com will be kind of a platform that
sounds amazing.
People can see this kind of work, and increasingly we'll be doing also online seminars there as well. But that's just kind of getting off the ground.
All right, and just to wrap it up, I was thinking, if there's one thing that you you kind of remember, like if there's one memory or, that you take away with all your hikes and all your time in Tibet, what would it be? Is there anything that comes to mind that can kind of evoke something for people?
Yeah, well, I think, it's the fire of life. We talk about the inner fire, but then we don't want to, miss out on the outer fire. It's just, this is tapping in, to go back to the etymological roots of key words like enthusiasm. It's, to be filled with the divine spirit, theos, God. So I think it's in all of our yogic practice, which is about seeking to find that complete coextensive unity and connectivity with the whole cosmos, as it were, the microcosm and the macrocosm. That the path really is one in which we have to find that inner bliss. We have to find that enthusiasm, the fire of life, and then and engage with our practices, not with asceticism in the sense of that we have something that we have to get rid of, but just something that we fill ourselves and infuse ourselves with the passion and enthusiasm for life. So I think that's really at the heart of the traditions. As you say, tapas revisited in the 21st century. Really see it as the fire of life.
I like the sound of that. Yeah, much more life affirming than living in a cave and trying not to desire anything, stopping your senses. It really makes sense for the modern practitioner. So I shall certainly, if not joining you on one of these, I'll certainly look at your website a lot more now. Thank you for coming on, Ian. It's been a great chat, and I'll put in the show notes everyone where you can find Ian and what he's doing next. So thanks again.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Yeah, enjoyed it.